Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm very excited to have this webinar on health literacy throughout drug development, why it matters to pharma and to patients. So just a reminder that today's webinar is sponsored by the National Health Council. And here we have listed our patient advocacy members and all of their logos. And we're very excited to introduce all of our members and the rest of the healthcare community also to this important topic of health literacy, and tying it back specifically for this particular webinar series to patient-focused medical product development. So I wanted to just review the outline for today's webinar before we launch right in. First, I will just briefly introduce the National Health Council's webinar series, our series on patient-focused medical product development, highlight a few resources on our website, review the objectives for today's webinar. I will introduce Laurie, our guest speaker, and then the moment everyone's been waiting for, I'll turn it over to Laurie to provide us with an introduction to health literacy. And then we will go into a live Q&A. So if you have a question that comes up during the session, please go ahead and just type it into the chat function. We'll save questions for the end, but we will have plenty of time to go through them. So feel free to, throughout the duration, to just go ahead and put them in the chat. And then just a reminder also, please don't unmute yourself during today's presentation. We really appreciate it. And then also another note for everybody is that the webinar is being recorded. And so a recording will be available on our website within the next couple of days or so. So here, if this is your first time joining us, just a reminder that this is part of a series that we've been doing now for actually about 2 years now. We started this in November of 2018, and originally the purpose of the webinar series was to introduce our members specifically to topics around clinical outcome assessment. That dovetails with the work that many of us are doing on patient-focused drug development and the guidances. And so we wanted to make sure everybody understood the terminology and topics related to clinical outcome assessment. For 2020, we expanded the program to cover additional topics. So we've covered this year specifically topics related to the rare disease listening sessions that NORD, our member organization, is leading. We've covered observer reported or proxy reported, also covered a topic related to value-based arrangements. And then last month, we had a wonderful presentation about real-world case examples. So I encourage folks to take a look on our website. If these topics look interesting to you, they are all available. And then also just a reminder that we're always wanting to share best practices, learnings, and everything. So if you have a case example that you'd like to share related to patient-focused medical product development, please, we really encourage you to share those. Also, if you have a topic that you'd like us to be covering as part of one of these series, please give us, send us an email, let us know. There's so many great topics, and we'd love to cover them to make sure that we're building a comprehensive education resource. But most importantly, I'm really excited for today's webinar. We'll be introducing health literacy and describing how health literacy can be integrated into your organization, whether you work for a patient organization, biopharmaceutical company, or in another research setting. And one of the reasons I'm so excited for today's webinar is that we had the chance to meet Laurie a couple of months ago now. And since that initial conversation that we've had, we've completely launched into the health literacy I don't want to say bubble, but the health literacy has now taken on a new role in all of the projects we've been doing. So now we've started really thinking about the role of health literacy in our patient experience and mapping project, which some of you are involved in. also in terms of the glossaries that we have on our website and so on and so forth. So I'm so excited because I think as you listen to Laurie and her enthusiasm, you'll see really so many takeaways that you'll be able to bring directly into your work, no matter what setting you're in. So I just wanted to take a moment now to introduce Laurie before I turn it over to her. So Laurie Myers is the Global Health Literacy Director at Merck. She's been working there since 2010, where she leads global health literacy efforts in support of improved patient communications, including medication labeling, packaging, clinical trial materials, lay summaries, and patient education. And she's been working to include respondents with low health literacy into patient labeling research and has earned a National Health Literacy Award. I think everybody is really going to benefit from Laurie's expertise in this topic, and I'm so excited to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm thrilled to be here today, and whether it's in the Q&A or whether it's an email after this, I'm always happy to talk about health literacy, including with other pharma companies. This is in that pre-competitive space. We should all be lifting up patients and empowering them to the extent we can. So anyway, so next slide, please. So today, what I wanted to talk about is what is health literacy and why does it matter? What are some examples to illustrate health literacy principles? And then most importantly of all, so if I get you fired up about health literacy, or if you already know some and learn some more, what can you do about that? What are some very tangible next steps for you? And then Q&A, of course, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions. So how familiar are you with health literacy? So the choices are A, I've never heard of health literacy until this webinar. B, I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. C, I'm familiar and I've worked to integrate it into my own work. Or D, I could give this webinar. Let's give it a few more seconds. Okay, that seems like that should be a good amount of time. So let's go to the answers if that's okay. Awesome. So it seems like there is a lot of opportunity, whether you are just beginning or working into it. And I'm going to make a guess that the person who would give this webinar is Jan Nissen. She also leads our patient innovation and engagement group and is passionate about health literacy. Moving on. So what do I do? You may not have heard the term Global Health Literacy Director, and if you haven't, there's a reason why. There's actually only 2 of us in the industry who work on health literacy, leading health literacy for our companies full time. The other person is at Lilly, Laurie Hall. She's phenomenal. We collaborate all the time. But what do I do? So first of all, I have a global focus on health literacy. I have the privilege of actually working on health literacy on 6 continents. And I also work across all divisions at Merck. And you're going to see some examples of from everything from clinical research to the commercial space and other things. Most importantly, as one person, it is not possible for me to do everything. And so the work that I'm going to share today, actually very little of it do I have anything to do with. It's really been champions who raise their hands and say, I see the opportunity to improve our communications. And we figure out how to do that. I don't want to mislead people, by the way, that we are perfect in all of our patient communications being health literate, not at all. We are, however, continually advancing, continually trying to make things better. We're way better than we were 2 years ago, and we'll be much better in 2 more years. Externally, I have the privilege of participating in a number of multi-stakeholder working groups. I'll reference one of them, the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center, a little bit later in this presentation. And again, working to figure out collaboratively, how do we advance health literacy integration into everything that touches patients, you know, from pharma and some other scenarios. I do believe in things like this, presenting and sharing best practices. And I also am a strong believer in publishing. And so there are a number of publications, most of which actually are with patient advocates as one of the stakeholders, because I think having a broad lens into thinking about health literacy is really important. And the last bullet is dream. So I've actually been with Merck 21 years, but for a decade, I've been doing health literacy. And if you had said a decade ago that it would be possible to get buy-in to health literacy at a 70,000 person company across multiple divisions, most people would have said that was impossible. But I really am a strong believer in believing the impossible and really trying to move a company. At this point, we've actually had 1,000 people trained in health literacy for a full day, including 700 in our clinical research organization. And I'm pretty sure none of those 700 had actually heard of health literacy a decade ago. So I really do believe that this is critical to just believe that we can do this. Next slide. So beyond the professional, health literacy is also deeply personal. So this was a family photo in 2011. My dad is the third person from the left. This was our annual Christmas tradition. On the next slide, these were images from 2013. So in 2012, my father was diagnosed with pelvic sarcoma and was told that he needed to amputate his leg. He did not want to do that. In fact, I'll never forget a few days before Christmas getting a call from him that he was essentially going to go into hospice because he did not want to amputate his leg. Through my own health literacy, through my connections at Merck, I was actually part of a cancer disparities working group and just happened to be there when I got this call. And a gentleman said to me, I have a mentee who focuses on pelvic sarcoma at MD Anderson. So he ended up, that's my daughter with him at MD Anderson. He ended up there for 4 months. He had a 15-hour surgery with 4 surgeons, 3 of whom were diverse and all of whom were world-class. And he, ended up getting the pelvic sarcoma removed. And his goal, the whole motivation for that was really to see my brother get married, which on the bottom right-hand corner, that was the day of my brother's wedding. He got to achieve that dream. And again, it was through my own health literacy I was able to navigate that. The next slide. Another example of health literacy was actually what happened in April of 2014, which was when a doctor at a local hospital said to my dad, Henry, you have done everything in the world, but at this point, there are no options to treat your cancer that won't kill you. You need to go home, be with your family, and enjoy your last 2 months of life. I have the privilege of sitting on the National Academy of Medicine Health Literacy Roundtable. We actually did a whole workshop about end-of-life decision-making and other things. But that was the kindest, most health literate thing that could ever have been said. And far too often we prolong life by, healthcare providers not having the courage to be clear and direct like that. And so, he was able to really, those are my 2 girls at the time with him, my mom, and he actually ended up giving a significant donation to Dr. Raphael Pollack, who had at the time was at MD Anderson to do pelvic sarcoma research. So again, when you think of health literacy, the navigation, the kindness of the doctor, but also throughout the whole journey, it was pretty overwhelming, right? My mom was head nurse for people with developmental disabilities for 40 years. She was totally overwhelmed at many, many points in the journey. And so when you think about health literacy, very few of us, even if it's what we do professionally, everybody can relate. It's a universal truth that we get really overwhelmed with health information at times. Next slide. So what is health literacy? So health literacy 2030 was just updated this summer, and I'm thrilled that the definition now addresses the 2-sided nature of health literacy. So in short, it's a person's ability to understand and use health information to make an informed and empowered health decision. The 2-sided nature now, Healthy People 2030, now realizes and recognizes the importance of organizational health literacy. So it's not just a person's ability to understand, but their understanding is within the context of healthcare. And everyone in that healthcare context has a responsibility to be providing information in a way that is understandable. And so, organizational health literacy isn't just, oftentimes we think of the doctor-patient conversation, but it's patient advocacy organizations, it's biopharmaceutical companies, it's pharmacies, it's many, many others. So I truly believe that each of us has a responsibility in working in healthcare in some way, or volunteering or other things, to make sure that we are creating materials that are understandable, and not just written materials, but actually, if you go to the next slide, thinking about all, and you can build on it again, but thinking about all of the skills that are needed for health literacy. So it's not just your ability to read, it's also your ability to speak. How do you ask questions? Are you comfortable asking questions? Your ability to listen, your ability to seek information and understand that it's credible. Digital literacy and the ability to navigate the internet to even find information that is relevant and that is credible. And so we actually did a study and looked at, I believe it was a whole bunch of queries around diabetes. And we looked at that from origin of zip code. And so, as everyone on this call knows, your zip code tells you a lot about a person's health. It also tells you a lot about a person's education and income. And so you can make a decent proxy for health literacy. And what we found was that people from zip codes where people were less likely to have proficient health literacy would do 2-word searches, and were more likely, or as likely, to spend as much time on, Dr. Phil as they were the Mayo Clinic. Whereas people from zip codes which were more likely to have proficient health literacy searched 6 or 7 words and, focused on credible information. So again, it's not just reading. Another really important thing is numeracy. So for instance, if you're diabetic, are you able to understand what your readings mean and give yourself the appropriate amount of insulin? If a doctor tells you to lose 5% of your body weight, what does that actually mean? So if you're 180 pounds, lose 9 pounds. These are things that are really also very important in the context of health. Next slide, please. So why is health literacy so important? I'll never forget the first time Ruth Parker shared the quote with me at the bottom, which is, poor health literacy is a stronger predictor of your health than your age, your income, your employment status, your education level, and your race. Again, think about that for a second. Health literacy, poor health literacy, is a stronger predictor of your health than any other demographic variable. This is something that we all have, I really truly believe, an ethical and a moral responsibility to be thinking about all the time. And not shockingly, health literacy affects a person's ability to access, use health services, navigate care, manage chronic conditions. We know that people, for instance, in the oncology space, people with low health literacy are more likely to come in at a later stage of cancer. So this has very, very real implications in terms of a person's health. Next slide. So who's affected by health literacy? While it is true that there are statistically some things that put you at greater risk of low health literacy, so age 65 plus, low socioeconomic status, lower levels of education, it's also true that every single one of us can struggle with health information. And so I think, there's probably not a person among us who can't say that at some point in time, they were really overwhelmed. Maybe your kid was sick and you were just really exhausted. Many other things. Maybe, and actually, if you go to the next slide, I don't care who you are. If you are diagnosed with cancer, all you hear is the word cancer, right? And let me just very quickly take another couple of examples. So positive biopsy. So positive in every other aspect of your life is a really good thing. So how many people hear they have a positive biopsy and think that's actually quite good news? Or even triple negative breast cancer. I was tested 3 times, it was negative, and therefore I'm in good shape. Aspirational biopsy, again, aspirational is something you dream of, right? So, not only are people overwhelmed, but the very terms and language that we assume people understand themselves can be quite deceptive. Next slide. So, improving health literacy, fortunately, even though by now you may think that health literacy is really important, which it is, we're going to talk about some tips. Really, improving health literacy is actually quite simple. And so on the next slide, So I wanted to highlight, and you can actually build it again, sorry. You know, when we think about pharma communication with patients, oftentimes we think about, you know, for instance, once a product's approved and how are we communicating? But in reality, there's so many times that pharma and patients are communicating either directly or through, you know, research sites or through providers. So the question is, how are we making sure that we are being health literate, again, as often as possible? So I'm not going to go through all of these because I'm going to show some examples in the next few slides. Next slide. Oh, so health literacy and clinical research. So we know that research can be really complicated and confusing. We know that using health literacy principles can improve patient understanding, safety, and of course, support trial integrity. One other point, which is not on this slide, is we know that there are many historic issues of trust in, for instance, the African American community that are very well deserved. The question is, how can we help to overcome them to do a better job of enrolling diverse participants in clinical trials? When I get that question, I say, you know, one of the ways to help to address trust is to be trustworthy. One of the ways to be trustworthy is to be clear, to be simple, to make sure that people have the information they need to make an informed and empowered decision, not only to participate in a trial, but to stay on trial or other things. And again, this isn't an extra step. Health literacy is about doing what you're already doing, but in a better way. So next slide, please. So can you recognize the jargon? So this was an actual brochure that we used in 2016. So on the next slide, we're about to do a poll. I'll leave it on this slide for just 1 second. And the question is, how many words or phrases of jargon are there? The poll that will pop up is 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, or 16 or more. And so I'll just give 1 minute here for people to read this before they do the poll on the next slide. So the question will be, how many words of jargon are in this brochure, this subset? Okay, we'll just give it 1 more minute. Okay, next slide. So how many words or phrases of jargon? Just give it 1 more sec. Okay, let's close the poll and see what people think. So most of you think 11 to 15, some think less, some think more. Let's go to the next slide. So the answer is D. 3/4 of you are actually incorrect. So when you think about jargon words, let me pull one out. Study, clinical research study. So what is study? Study is what you do when you do your homework, right? Risks. Risk is actually quite a loaded term. Investigational, study medicine, even things like IV and oral. So I'll give you an example for, just to illustrate one word, oral. Oral seems very simple. So there are many examples when a child was given oral antibiotics for an ear infection, that people then go pour the antibiotic into a person's ears because they don't know what oral is, instead of saying by mouth. Study drugs. So again, when we've done listening sessions with people and we use the word study drug, people say, well, drug is bad, right? It's cocaine, it's heroin. So why would I ever want to do that? And so we can't be clear enough. And we also can't do enough to ask patients, you know, what their perspective is. And I've had many discussions with patient advocacy over the years around, you know, the people who self-select to participate in a patient advocacy or to seek the resources of patient advocacy groups oftentimes are the ones who often may have adequate or proficient health literacy. And so how are we making sure we meet the needs of people who are really overwhelmed when they're newly diagnosed, for instance? All right, next slide. So medical jargon, and the people 65 and older rather than elderly, I smile here because I think of my mom. So just for context, we were running how we figured this out. And I need to also acknowledge Health Literacy Media. They are a group that we work with that actually I know now Elizabeth is working with. They do our health literacy reviews for us across the company. They are phenomenal. So we were having difficulty recruiting for a trial that was for elderly people with mild memory loss. And we sent it to them and they said, why don't you say people 65 plus rather than elderly? And it was like, duh, of course. My mom is 74. She does yoga and Pilates every week. She rides her exercise bike. She would never relate to being elderly. And so again, just the jargon that we use without thinking about it can really be have significant implications for participation in trials and other things. Next slide. So, and you can hit advance again, please. So I always use this example to, show the before and after, right? So health literacy, this was actually instructions in a phase 1B trial that patients, was for about a diabetes medicine, and they had to actually give themselves an injection. And on the left was kind of our standard approach. And we sent it to Health Literacy Media. And you see on the right, I use this to illustrate, it's not just language, it's also things like white space, pictures, illustrations, fonts, bolding, and other things that really, make a material health literate. Next slide. Oh, and by the way, I always use that as an example of one of the questions I get sometimes is, will people who are well educated be insulted by health literate content? And on the slide before, I think I've asked that question at this point to thousands of people, which do you prefer? And people prefer the one on the right, right? And so regardless of whether you have challenges with health literacy, adequate health literacy, or proficient health literacy, we all prefer health literate materials. So that is one of the biggest myths of health literacy, is we're somehow going to insult people who are well educated. And I can tell you that is never the answer. I'm going to speak in a few minutes about our patient labeling work. But again, in that example, people with low health literacy feel very empowered by health literate information. People with proficient health literacy are like, some of the things we might hear are, I'm really crazy busy and I could give this to my parents and they would understand it, right? Or I can find the information I need really quickly. So please, if you leave here, don't believe that you will insult people with health literate materials. It's just not ever the case. If people want more information, they will find it. Next slide. Informed consent, and here's another example of how you can take something that's really overwhelming and summarize it, into something much simpler. Instead of saying, here's the 20 inclusion exclusion, you can say who can join. You may be able to join the study if you're between this age and have this. There may be reasons why you can't be in this study. Your doctor's staff will discuss it with you, right? People understand that, and it's much more approachable, and then much more of, people will be truly much more informed. Next slide. This was actually, when people think about health literacy, people mistakenly often think about making things shorter. Here's an example of text that we actually added to the informed consent document that actually made it longer, but it was, I think, really important. So you're being asked to be in a study. It's your choice. This form will help you decide. If you agree to join, you can leave. If you don't agree to join, or if you leave, you're not going to lose benefits you had before this study. Take your time, ask this doctor or staff any questions. And if you agree to join, please sign this form after you understand all of the information. So again, that's taking a document that can be a little overwhelming to people sometimes and making sure they understand their rights. Next slide. So on our diversity and culture, so I'm really thrilled that starting last year, we have training in cultural diversity, teach back, and health literacy as a standard part of our investigator training for all studies. It's not specific to anyone. Probably the other thing that jumps out to you about this is the diversity within the images. So that came, like many things that happen for all of us, we learned from things we could do better. So we had a listening session with African American women with breast cancer, and said to them, you know, tell us, give us feedback on the brochure. And one woman said politely, you know, the people in this brochure look like you, they don't look like me. And it was like, aha, duh, right? Again, sometimes some of the things, once we learn this, kind of seem like, of course we shouldn't have done that. But it was the genesis of a photo shoot, a diversity photo shoot, where we now have images, for instance, of Muslim women doctors treating white men. And I can tell you that when I have conversations with people of Muslim faith, they say to me, do you know how affirming that is? Do you know how empowering that is? And also another really important thing is representing the diversity of culture within cultures. So for instance, many of our images of Hispanic Americans were people from Mexico rather than from Cuba, from Latin America, from other places. We had our images of people of Asian descent were from China or Japan rather than Vietnam. And so again, the first thing that people see if they're considering a trial and they see a brochure is, can I relate to this? And having diverse and inclusive imagery is incredibly important. I know diversity in clinical trials is something that you know, we're all passionate about, and it's essential, right? Well, if you look at COVID trials and you look at people being disproportionately impacted by COVID, we must get diversity in clinical trials right. Health literacy is, I believe, an essential tool for all companies to be thinking about and embedding as is possible. Next slide. So teach back in clinical trials. So what is teach back? And I'm gonna really simplify it. But teach back is, instead of saying, do you have any questions, saying, what questions do you have? Or what are you gonna go home and tell your partner? And when a person, you know, says back what they think they heard, if it is not correct, the one doing the communication says, I apologize, I'm sorry that I wasn't clear, let me try again, and confirming understanding again. So it shifts the burden of understanding from the person receiving the communication to the one doing the communication. When you think about cultural traditions, in some cultures, there is tremendous respect for physicians. This is a really important tool to help to address some potential cultural barriers to having patients truly understand. Next slide. So here's an example of, you know, sometimes it is just language. So before, and again, all these examples are from our own company, and there's still many more that we could do. I understand that authorized healthcare providers, organizations, and professionals that receive or access health information about me pursuant to this authorization may redisclose this information to healthcare providers, or you get the idea. I understand that those who receive my healthcare information may give this information to others who are not involved in my care. Again, the number of people who understand that is dramatically higher. Next slide, and we're almost done here. So I mentioned labeling and the different perspectives. So a number of years ago, we began for new molecules to figure out how do we develop a patient label, medication label, that can be understood by people of all health literacy levels. We didn't really know how to, so we engaged with Dr. Ruth Parker at Emory University and Dr. Kara Jacobson and Dr. Michael Wolf at Northwestern and his team as well. We said, how do we do this? And you know, the key lessons for us were, first of all, we develop a draft of the label, and then we have Northwestern and Emory actually review it from a health literacy lens. And then they actually, we try to honor and respect their comments. And then they do focus groups with people across the range of health literacy levels and figure out where some potential misunderstanding or errors may be. And we actually say that. We say, look, we want to make sure this is clear. So if you don't understand anything, let us know. And then we try to honor and respect their comments. And then it comes to us for comprehension testing. And one of the things we used to do is do only online surveys or comprehension testing. What we found is that the only people who are willing to be paid to read medical information is people who are self-selecting into market research. And so they were only adequate health literacy. So we actually started going to literacy centers and senior centers and finding people who weren't participating. And what you see is, and we actually have, I think, 6 of these now approved by the FDA. I know you can't read it, that's okay, but what you can see is, first of all, it's short. We had to really work with our clinical teams to say, you know, we don't need to put the same information 3 different places. Let's figure out where it belongs best. You see the formatting, the white space, and other principles of health literacy. Next slide. And not shockingly, when we create health literate information, we really get very positive feedback from patients and from caregivers. And we hear that it's something that would be meaningful to them and also empowers them to understand. I'll never forget, there was a woman who her first language was Spanish, and she actually started crying after she read it. And she said, I never understand these things. And if I got this one, not only, and something went wrong with the medicine, not only would I know, but I'd know what to do. And if that doesn't keep you wanting to stay in your job doing health literacy, I don't know what does. So next slide, please. Patient education. The brochure on the left was done by a gentleman, Christian Lewis, whose mom had actually died of C. diff after getting outpatient antibiotics from the dentist. And so he wanted everybody to understand how, you know, the risks of C. diff. And he taught, you know, he put everything in there, why it's such an urgent health risk and everything else. But actually, by giving so much detail, it was actually quite difficult to discern the most important information, which was if you had diarrhea 3 or more times and you took an antibiotic or you went to the hospital, then you should, you know, consider whether or not you might have C. diff. And so, again, this is something that I've done various roles within Merck, and we're oftentimes guilty of the last, right? Which is we want to tell everybody everything instead of really, it's actually much more difficult to figure out what's the most important piece of information that is actionable that you need to make sure is very clear. Next slide. Packaging. So this actually won a packaging award, which was pretty cool. But it really was important because it was funny going into this work group. What we found is that the work streams working on the packaging and the patient labeling were actually not the same groups of people in all cases. So they weren't always fully aligned. So even part of the exercise in health literacy was simply getting the right people in the room to have a conversation between them. And again, we applied best practices in health literacy, and I truly believe improved people's ability to follow the directions in the package. Next slide. And so I teased Jan a little bit earlier. She runs our patient innovation and engagement group, but she and everyone on our team have been phenomenal champions of health literacy. And so with her permission, I borrowed the slide. So this is what are the foundational principles of our patient innovation and engagement group. And I'm really proud that one of the 5 principles is health literacy. So they aim to really try to make sure we are applying principles of health literacy to everything that we do. Again, aspirational, but they've done a phenomenal job of raising awareness throughout our company of that in many, many areas. Next slide. So, you know, a few things people worry about are, will my materials lose meaning if they're less detailed? And the answer is no. How much effort does it take? When you first start, it takes a little more. But you get, it's really not rocket science, right? There's free training, and I'll talk in 1 second about resources. But once you get in the habit of doing it, you don't even think of it any other way. And will health literacy put us at risk for legal problems? And so I have many champions of health literacy within the legal department. And what they say is, at first when I heard about this, I thought there might be, liability or whatever. But now I understand our risk is actually reduced if people understand. And so lawyers can be strong champions. And when you have conversation with them about what you're trying to achieve, they're very, very supportive. Next slide. So where can you go if you want to learn more? There's a couple of places that all of which are free. So I mentioned the MRCT Center earlier. We actually had had the privilege of co-chairing a working group on health literacy and clinical research. This had pharma, patient advocacy, academic researchers, and others. And so if you go to mrctcenter.org/health-literacy, you can see case studies, you can see slide decks to help you make the case for health literacy in your own organizations and other things. The CDC Health Literacy website is not specific to this, but it's still just phenomenal. If you Google CDC Health Literacy, you'll find it. They have free online training in everything from health literacy to numeracy. They also have something called the Clear Communication Index, which is a 20-question assessment tool to help you understand and what is the health literacy of your own materials. There is Health Literacy Online website to help you in the digital and online space. A number of us actually co-authored a perspective from the National Academies about how do you enhance numeracy skills or people's ability to understand numbers. If you're interested in watching a whole day workshop on this, there was a clinical trials meeting at the Health Literacy Roundtable. And finally, Kara Jacobson and Ruth Parker, two of the people we work with closely, wrote a front and back checklist on principles of health literacy that I just love. So thank you, and I'm here to answer questions. And next slide, I guess I can. Oh, and this is the website that I mentioned, how health literacy applies during the clinical trial, best practices, case studies, examples, and where to begin in your own clinical research role. Next slide, I think that's it. Sorry, I jinxed myself. Where do you start in your own organization? The first thing is making it a priority, right? Deciding this is something you want to do. Dreaming big, to come back to the other. Establishing a team, and that doesn't have to be people dedicated to health literacy. In most of the world, it's not. It's people who are passionate about really empowering patients to be full participants and engaged. Setting objectives, and I say, don't aim for perfection, aim for progress. Providing training and resources, and then measuring, figuring out, are you able to make strides? Next slide, I think that's it. Yes, thank you.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Laurie. This was a wonderful presentation. And we've gotten a number of questions in. So I'll start with Ava's question is, if you have patient review panels, and if so, do you set them up on an ad hoc basis or recruit a broad group of patients in advance to reach out to when needed?
Sure. So let me go back to the patient labeling as an example, right? So what we do is with Northwestern Emory, they go to different groups of patients that they recruit locally. With that, we actually work with, for instance, a market research vendor who can go and look for people with that disease, look for caregivers of people with that disease, or people who match the demographic. So that is sort of an ad hoc group of average patients, if you can say it that way, because there's no such thing, but people who are not necessarily self-selecting. And in terms of the in terms of patient advisor groups, a lot of that work would happen under Jan's organization. What I can tell you is that, when they do things on an ad hoc basis and look for patients, they very much are attuned to health literacy and trying to make sure that we have a range of cultural backgrounds as well as a range of health literacy levels.
Thank you. And I know that you already touched a little bit upon it, but we did have a question come through specifically about the legal review. So I wanted to just probe a little bit on that question as
Sure.
well. Is You know, they're wonderful examples before and after. And if you could speak a little bit more about maybe if it's your first time doing something like this with a legal team, how do you get them to say, yes, this is fine for the first time, and then hopefully it's easier from there?
Sure. That's always, actually, I'm shocked it's the second question. That's usually the very first question I get. So first of all, there is a gentleman named Chris Trudeau, Chris, Trudeau, and he is the health literacy lawyer of the world. And so he's actually written articles about this that are very short and are great and that I would highly recommend. Honestly, you can shoot me an email and I will jump on a call with you and help you talk through it. I mean, I'm really passionate about this. What I can tell you is that, you know, when you have conversations with lawyers and you teach them a little bit about health literacy and you say, you know, here's what we're trying to do. I think, sorry, one thing I didn't mention is you always have to honor the letter and the spirit of every rule and regulation while being health literate. So that is probably the first thing I would say to lawyers, which is, look, it's really important to me to make sure that we are honoring the letter and the spirit of every rule and regulation. So for instance, if there's FDA mandated language you have, you can't change that, right? So the question is, what can you do given all of those things? And when you start to probe a little bit on how come something is done this way, oftentimes you find out that it's just because you've always done things that way rather than because they're legally required. But I think you need to have a conversation about health literacy with lawyers, you know, before you even have that. And I can tell you that when I first started this, I actually had a health literacy lawyer, I called her. She just retired this year, and now I have another one, but there's many other lawyers who have been champions. And so having somebody in the legal group who is very patient-focused is probably where I'd start to have this conversation and then help use them as an advocate with others. The other thing is showing some examples of before and after and you can have this presentation, there's no reason you can't, helps people see really quickly why it's important.
Another question is, do you create informational websites as a key part of patient or caregivers' communications? And do you have examples of well-developed drug or clinical research sites from a health literacy perspective?
So I apologize. I am not the right person to answer the first part of the question, because my focus is on empowering people to, you know, bring health literacy to what they do. So what I can tell you is that there are many, you know, product teams who have reached out to me who have worked with health literacy media. I can't say for sure that they're all health literate or that they're not all health literate. I apologize. It's just not, it's a little bit outside of what I do every day. But I can tell you there's a strong commitment to health literacy among many teams. Well-developed drug or clinical research sites. So what I would actually say is to go back to the MRCT Center website, because what we've really tried to do there is to give some case studies and best practices in how do you develop them, what do they look like, what are some good examples. And the examples are far broader than our company. I just mentioned a few there, or showed a few there. But there's, you know, even though Lilly has, is the other company, has somebody fully dedicated to health literacy, there's somebody I work with at Pfizer, there's somebody I work with at AbbVie, there's somebody at BMS, like there's many of us who are very passionate about this. And then from a patient advocacy side, there's many patient advocacy organizations that are really passionate about this. So there's many examples out there, and I would say start with the MRCT.
That's great. Thank you. One other question that came in, oops, now it just moved, is, where did it go? Here we go. What is the most common feedback that you receive during the patient focus groups while reviewing patient labeling? And go ahead.
Sure, and yes, and I've I've shared this with the FDA too. So the number one feedback we get from people reviewing the labeling is, you've told me all about the risks, but you haven't told me why I should take this medicine. That's at a much higher level than me. But I have given that feedback. I've had the privilege of speaking at the FDA a number of times about this topic, and I always make sure I get that in. I have no control over that one, but that is definitely the number one feedback we have is the labels really focus only on risk.
That makes sense. That it that would be a feedback that comes up. One other question is, when talking about health literacy, people often put the onus on the patient and caregiver to learn all of the terms. And if you have any thoughts about how we can change that.
Absolutely. So, you know, I'm really glad that Healthy People 2030 just updated the definition to talk about the two-sided, both the individual as well as the organizational health literacy. The definition most commonly used in the US before that focused only on the individual, and I think it should be exactly the opposite, that the main area of focus should be on the organizational and the situational context. People only understand in the context of communication, and the burden should be on the communicator, not the one doing the communication, not on the one receiving it. I firmly believe that. And I implore everyone having, you know, conversations about understanding to really make sure that that's clear. It's the people in charge of the information are the ones who have the greatest obligation, in my opinion. And by the way, one of the things I'll never forget, I was visiting a clinic in Nebraska, and there was a gentleman who was about a year and a half out of all his medical training, and he had been working in a clinic that was serving many Hispanic patients. And he said to me, in medical school, I was trained on this for about a whopping 2 days. This was considered the soft stuff, right? This wasn't, and I think things are changing, by the way, now. That was probably 5 years ago, and I think there's been much more attention on this lately. But he said, I didn't know, for instance, that in Mexico, if you are obese, that's actually could be a sign of wealth. And so if I was counseling my diabetes patients, I didn't know that, and that would have been something that would have been very helpful. And I'm not trying to in any way, shape, or form stereotype, or that, this was just a cultural tradition that he had learned about from his patients. And he said, nobody taught me how to communicate well. So I didn't know that I had to go understand the cultural traditions. I didn't understand teach back, right? And now it's taken me all this time, but think of all the people I could have treated better if I had known that. And so I think medical schools are really rising much more to the occasion now, for instance, of teaching this. I think the recent focus, I mean, for so many years, obviously, systemic racial injustice has been a huge issue. But I think the visibility on it has increased in 2020. And so recognizing the role that racism can play in health and healthcare, again, I think is starting to bring many of these issues to the forefront. And I'm very hopeful that health literacy will continue to be a part of those conversations. Sorry, that was a really long answer to your question.
No, it was, it's really helpful. And one thing that I wanted to ask you to touch a little bit more upon was when we were preparing for the webinar, you spoke a lot about how, you know, there's so many different levels to this. Is if you're let's say you're a graduate student, or if you're a tiny patient organization that doesn't have a whole lot of resources to spend on an external consultant, that there are educational resources out there. There are steps you can take at that layer, and then there's, you know, organizational wide steps that can be taken as well. Could you just touch upon it a little bit more?
Absolutely. So the first thing I would do for people who want to increase their own skills in health literacy would be to go to the CDC Health Literacy website and take the trainings, right? They have just phenomenal, they're not specific to healthcare, but they're excellent trainings in kind of best practices in health literacy and numeracy and other things. And so, you know, I think in total, the trainings are about 4 hours. The Clear Communication Index is a free tool that probably takes 10 minutes to fill out. So you don't need to have significant resources or even honestly significant time to make a huge difference in just this. And another, you know, we talk about user feedback, and I talked a lot about formal testing and, you know, literacy centers here. So you don't even need to do that, right? I mean, you do, right? It's a great idea. But without resources, you can take something you're working on, and first of all, you could give it to a colleague who is not working in that therapeutic area, right? You can, hey, what do you think of this? And you have to make sure you're clear, you need to be honest. But most importantly, bring it home to your family, right? We say that people read at about 5 years, 5 grades lower than the last level of education they finished. So someone who's graduated high school likely reads at a 7th grade reading level. We aim for 6th to 8th grade is kind of the standard for health literacy. And so if you share something with your kid who's in 7th grade, they should be able to understand it. And if they don't, that should give you pause. You should bring it to your parents and say, Mom, Dad, I need your partner, right? Or whoever it is. I want your feedback on this. Can you understand this? Because just doing user testing within the context of your own community, within the context of your own home, it's free, it's, quick, it's cheap, inexpensive, it's free, and it can give you tremendous insight. So, don't get overwhelmed by the idea that it has to be expensive, it has to be formal. Informal user testing, following the CDC training and guidelines will bring you really, really far.
Thanks. One super easy point that I learned this past week, you mentioned we're working with health literacy media now on some of our projects. And one of the questions that had come up was in an interview guide, we said, thank you for participating in this study, which I thought, nothing to that, but they came back and said, well, is the study the interview? Because if that's the case, you should just say interview here. And make it very clear that they're not part of some kind of an interventional study or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that was one really quick takeaway that I'll definitely bring forward, and I thought was a great example. One, and I know we're nearly at time, but Laurie, one question that I wanted to ask you was, in the context of right now there's so much confusion about terms related to science and scientific method, mm-hmm. Clinical research, and so on and so forth, is if you've seen a resource that's sort of similar to the CDC resource on health literacy that is a really health literate way of communicating about just science or clinical research that you might suggest that our participants could share with their constituents.
So not to go back to the MRCT Center, but they actually have been working on a glossary that is on the website. So I think mm-hmm. that might be at least a place to start. I don't know exactly what's on there right now. I can tell you we're working on a glossary ourselves too. But, I just want to mention one thing, which is many people have never thought about or heard about clinical trials until now, right? Mm-hmm. And so, when people are hearing about things for the first time, and and there's not necessarily, health literacy or whatever, that can have huge implications on people's, vaccine confidence, for instance, or other things. So, I think it's really, really important as we're in this pandemic. And let me give a very simple example is we always say, wear a mask, instead of saying wear a covering that covers your mouth and your nose, right? So health literacy, I truly believe, is an important tool to help flatten the curve of COVID and the pandemic. And there are phenomenal resources like the IHLA, the International Health Literacy Association, had a webinar this morning specific to COVID and health literacy. So there's a gentleman named Scott Ratson has written articles about vaccine literacy. So there's a lot out there. We actually wrote one on cancer literacy. So there's a lot out there to help you think about this in the context of specific areas.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I wanted to just go to this screen. I know Laurie had made the generous offer. If you had any follow-ups, that you're welcome to reach out to her. And so her email address is listed here. I know we've gotten all kinds of notices in the chat about how wonderful your presentation was. And
thank you.
really appreciate that. Thank you.